I'm Geraldine Witchers, reporter with the Manitoba Co-operator, and I love cats. Instagram knows I love cats, so its algorithm spits out posts and posts of those fuzzy buggers. I couldn't tell you exactly how they do it. I know they follow me around the internet and collect data on me. That's the price I pay for free access to Instagram and fluffy cat pics. That's relatively common knowledge, I think, thanks to snafus like the Cambridge Analytica scandal back in 2018. We know that tech companies sell our data for purposes both banal and nefarious. But does that apply to agriculture tech companies? Author and researcher Kelly Bronson says yes. But the way we talk about agricultural data gets in the way of us seeing it. We'll hear from her in a moment, but first, a word from our sponsors.
Maybe you've had an idea about upgrading your operation. Maybe about finally getting that renovation done or buying some new equipment. Or maybe you're thinking about how you can be a bit more financially secure from season to season. Get some help making it happen by speaking with an RBC Agriculture Account Manager. Then, set up an investment plan to make even more of your ideas happen. Visit rbc.com/chartyourcourse and get started today.
Dr. Kelly Bronson is the Canada Research Chair in Science and Society at the University of Ottawa. She recently wrote a book where she examines the way we talk about data. We treat it almost like a mystical material untouched by human hands that has the ability to solve all our problems. She calls it the Immaculate Conception of Data.
So the Immaculate Conception, just as you say, is a way of thinking about, talking about data as if data were just a natural resource, raw, pulled from the ground, that doesn't then make visible, or it works to invisibilize all of the people and the human decision-making that go into deciding which datum to collect in the first place, on which variables, and then, all of the other decisions, how those data sets get structured and how they get used for whose benefit. And so, while all of the amazing, data scientists from both public and private sector I spent time with in the course of writing the book, I'm sure they wouldn't, if I said to the, nobody would actually say, oh, that there is such thing as an immaculately conceived datum, right? They wouldn't, if pressed, adhere to that framework. They would say, of course, I myself, I witnessed them doing that work, right? The very difficult and messy work of collecting those data and trying to get the farm tools to work. In many cases, they weren't working perfectly. And, but yet it's this really dominant way that not even in the ag sector alone, but I think you'll start to notice like everywhere we talk about data this way. And I sort of came to see that there's a power in that kind of framework, right? And it connects to these long-standing ideas we have about technology and what technologies can do for society. I mean, even that language, right? Technologies don't do anything. Humans do things with tools, and it's humans who design the tools in the first place. And yet we have this really long-standing way of talking about technology as if it drives history, right? And does these amazing things, progress, et cetera. And so it's this really powerful framework, right? I came to see that people were using it, right? Like in their pitch at a data convention, or I came to see that even like activist farmers who are working against, some of the issues in our food system, like unequal power between corporations and farmers, they were still participating in you talking about data this way. And I came to see that it's really helpful, right? It's really great to talk about data as the next thing, and it's driving us toward this bright shiny future called Farm 4.0. And isn't it going to be great? And even if your idea of Farm 4.0 looks totally different, if you're an activist scientist versus a scientist working for Bayer Monsanto, right? And that was like that thing with the first two chapters, or chapter 2 and chapter 3, right? It's like, if you're in the private sector, you probably think that Farm 4.0 looks like fewer and fewer farmers and bigger farms and machinery driving itself, farmers being able to farm from anywhere. And who needs farmers anyway? And farm work is this drudgery, and isn't automation either, like if it's an artificial intelligence replacing a farmer's decision making, or whether it's an actual robot replacing mechanical labor. So that's sort of like that might be one vision for this Farm 4.0. And then the activists I spent time with who are just as enthused about data have a totally different version of Farm 4.0, which is open data and open science in these really close-knit communities for community-supported agriculture or community food sovereignty. So, with farmers working the land, but just sort of enabled by technologies like data technology. Anyway, they have radically different visions of the future, and yet they both see that data are the future and taking us toward the future. And the whole reason I write around this framework, which you said, might not be, it's maybe a bit, well, it's difficult, right? When you have these really dominant ways of talking about things or thinking about things, to point out the things that are most obvious. Sometimes that's really difficult work. But the reason I wrote the whole book around the Immaculate Conception of Data in a way was because I think it's really part of what's preventing many of us from seeing that in agriculture, just like in other contexts, right, there are really powerful interests behind the collection of data and the use and misuse of data. And so if we continue to talk about data as if they're natural, right, then we don't really interrogate, oh, wait a second, who's collecting that data? And what we can't really peek behind the curtains of the data science and the corporate uses of data.
In her research, Kelly talked to big agribusiness companies and to, as she calls them, activist farmers, smaller scale farmers with non-corporate ideals. I asked her, if both groups have such different viewpoints, why did they both use the Immaculate Conception of Data viewpoint? She suggested this is because it connects to this long-standing idea that technology drives progress and improves society.
I can say that why do I think that these really different social groups that I spent time with in the context of writing this book, right? The people working in private sector, the data scientists working for John Deere or for Bayer Monsanto, the big corporate farmers using these systems, and then, these like small activist farmers who are, doing work for small agricultural systems and what we might say alternative agricultural systems. Why do they all participate in talking about data this way? Well, I mean, as I say in the book, you have to think of the framework not as necessarily a false view, even though it is. Like, technologies don't do anything on their own, and there are lots of people behind the technologies. But talking about technologies, and in this case, in data and data agricultural projects this way, is a really powerful way of talking about it, right? It's like I saw it work to like turn, people around and enlist people in the support, right, at a convention, right? If you say like, this is the future and data are going to get us there, or usually the framing is, this is this big problem we have in agriculture. And so if you're a company and you're selling your technology to a large grain farmer in the Midwest, it's look at the problem of agricultural labor, right? Finding enough laborers, look at the drudgery of being on the farm. And wouldn't you want to Wade Barnes, the head of Farmer's Edge, in one of his pitches said, in the future, you'll be able to farm from anywhere. You can fish while you farm, right? You can be on vacation with your family and be farming, because automation is going to replace the farmer. And so it's part of the pitch. So activist scientists told me, like, we've got all sorts of problems in agriculture, but if we just have open data projects, and, we're going to have this bright, shiny future, which for them, again, is this like community food sovereignty and alternative agriculture, not the big corporate agricultural model. But so for everyone, it was part of the pitch, basically, right? I think they're participating in reproducing these, again, longstanding ways of talking about technology and society in this context, right? Talking about data and agriculture, because it really works, right? In a context where, right, humans we know make really flawed decisions. In a context where, like, across the board, all we have is really fraught and tense, like, political discourse, and, and politicians who we probably can't trust, and corporations we can't trust. But data, if they're immaculate, if they came down from on high, right, they're objective, and therefore they're powerful, right? They're outside of all these interests, and they're going to solve all of the problems we have. So whether the problem is feeding the world by 2050, so that's how, like, the World Bank would talk about these technologies, right? We need to feed the world, and therefore we need data-driven agriculture. Or, Bayer Monsanto might also say it's about feeding the world or about sustainability. Or if they're trying to sell their technology to a farmer in a corporate ad, they might say it's about farm labor, right? And allowing you to farm from anywhere, or it's about competitive advantage, right?
Risk management, I think.
Risk management, exactly. So it's part of the pitch, right? It's a much better sell to say, let's get outside of all the messiness of human decision making. Data are going to take us to bright, shiny future, no matter what that future is.
For those of us who use Twitter, Facebook, Google, and so forth, it's not a surprise to hear those companies are collecting data from us. We might not think about it or like it, but we know it's happening and that it's being used, probably, to sell us something. By comparison, while I knew that modern farm equipment, for instance, collects data all the time, I knew far less about what happens to it. I asked Kelly, have I been living under a rock?
No, I don't think you have. And that's really why I wrote the whole book around that framework, because I think that it was really curious to me. Like, the book started out, as I say in the intro chapter, but as, like, I just thought, we need some research on, who's collecting data and what's being done with those data, and a kind of description of what was happening, right, in the ag sector around the collection and uses of what's called big data. And then it turned into, it is that on one level. But then, the immaculate conception of data, the book turned into, wait a second, when I started to really look, why does it seem, at least, like there isn't really that much attention, both scholarly at the time, it's still basically true, and in the scholarly domain, but certainly popularly, why is there not, as you say, widespread knowledge and kind of not dissent necessarily, but at least suspicion around the uses and potential misuses of personal data in the agricultural realm? Because I just didn't see it, and it was really curious to me on the heels of what seemed to be this grand kind of dissent around Facebook, right, and big tech, and like a techlash, mostly because of the enormous profiting, right, off of the data that we create through our online behavior. And there was Cambridge Analytica scandal, right, around not just the profiting, but also the misuses of those data for psyops and rigging, right, elections, both in the US and the Brexit election. And so on the heels of all of that kind of, techlash that centers on data and internet data, I wondered, well, like, why isn't anyone making any noise or looking into data collected in the agricultural realm or domain? And I just didn't see it. And I still don't really see it, to be honest. And so the book makes this argument that partly it's that there's this framework for talking about data that's not helping us really look into the interests, I might call it, right? Whether it's economic interest, I mean, that's largely it, behind the collection of agricultural data. And it is weird because, as you say, there is suspicion even among the farmers who by Bayer Monsanto Seed Systems, right, around corporate interest and oversight. But it hasn't really blown up yet.
Is it because there haven't been the same level of scandal?
I think that's exactly it. I think that what's going to happen is if we think about Facebook, right, it's not like, there's been some regulatory leadership, especially in the European Union, around data and corporate power. Like they have the GDPR and some regulatory levers for sort of trying to manage how data get collected, or at least create transparency for ordinary people around how data are being collected or which data are being collected. But I think we only really have that. There's hardly any really regulation still of those corporations and what they do with data. And the only things we really know about and are because, as you say, of scandals or leakages like Cambridge Analytica. So I think that with agriculture, I suspect the same thing is going to happen. We're just further behind, that this is sort of going to be worked out in the court of public opinion in the future. Part of the intervention I wanted to make was, hey, unlike social media, this is kind of a new thing, right? These former chemical and then life science corporations are just starting to, I think, become data corporations. And why don't we try to figure out right now what is being done, and in the regulatory or policy space, what ought to be done, right? Have a kind of conversation now about who should get compensated for data collection and, what can be done with data. And because I think there's an opening for us to do something about it now before we have those major scandals like have happened with social media data.
So, what's being done with that data? Sales is the obvious one, but that's not the only draw for ag companies.
Yeah. And, I think what really cheeses a lot of people is not just that the data are used to sell us stuff. Some people probably appreciate those targeted ads and those algorithms, and right. Sometimes they kind of get you right in their psychological construction of your needs and desires. But I think what most people really resent, at least I can speak for myself, is that, it's that the data collection then, is used to create aggregate data sets, which by the companies collecting the data are sold as an asset, right? To the jeans company who's trying to sell you a pair of blue jeans, or to the, I have an anxiety necklace and this was a targeted ad, right? And so it's not so much that you're being advertised to, but that behind that is a very, very profitable data set, right? That was sold to this, anxiety necklace company, or they paid for access to the data set more likely. And it's that assetization and the incredible money that's made off of our behavior online, right? Which I think cheeses a lot of people. And then, that money turns into incredible power, such that these large corporations can operate beyond the purview of national regulation, et cetera. I think it's Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon together have twice the wealth of all African nations. That's just absurd. Mm-hmm. And so, but that same, I wrote an academic article this year about this, kind of what are some of because it's a bit of a difficult gig, as you say. It's not really, people haven't started to talk about this happening in the agricultural context, and the risks don't seem as immediately apparent, right? I think people just assume, farm environments, it's just data on crops. What can be done with those data? First of all, it's not just data on crops, right? It's personal data too. So the tractors, for example, the 8 Series tractors from John Deere, the precision equipment, they collect data on hundreds of variables, including the farmer, right? From the time that the cab door gets opened. So it's personal data, like social media. Some of it is. It's on farm laborers and...
What kind of personal data about the farmer can they collect?
Movement of the workers, when the worker's coming in and out, how they're using the tractor.
How many breaks they take.
Yeah, exactly. Which can help if you're a large manager, right? An operator, and you have more than one vehicle and you have farm workers, and it's a way for you to kind of police or manage your farm laborers. But collects data on the equipment, et cetera. But I think it's also just similar to the social media context. It's that these data sets can be, I'm sure they are. We know they are because there have been a few watchdog organizations like ETC Group that have found years ago, right, legal agreements about data transfer between John Deere and Monsanto. This was before the acquisition or the consolidation, the Bayer-Monsanto merger, sorry. And so we know that data are being transferred and those data sets are being sold. And so, right, there's that same kind of, hey, wait a second, this isn't fair. There's that same injustice, I would say. And maybe even more so, because as we know in the agricultural context, unlike social media, the farmers who are paying John Deere through, for access to data-driven advice, the decision platform, if they buy into my farm manager, they're paying with their data that the company is going to make money off of, and they're paying to access insights from those data. So they're paying twice. So there's that same issue of like what we might call incommensurate benefit, right? The companies stand to make real money from personal data that the farmers are helping to collect. So that's one issue that's very similar, I would say, to social media. Mm-hmm. And then you're right. Then the companies can use those data. They're going to sell, companies collecting the data can sell those data sets. The data sets become an asset. So it's another way for them to make money. And we all know that no matter how large a farmer you are, there's, it's difficult to farm. There's no money in primary production, really, unless you're one of those big corporations. So even if you like John Deere and you're a John Deere person, you probably still, no matter how large your farm, know that, heck, John Deere Corporation is turning a much bigger profit than you are as a commodity grower. And so there's that issue, right? It's not fair that the companies stand to make even more money in a situation where we know that agribusinesses make a lot of money in the food system relative to farmers. But then, then we can guess about how those data are going to be used. So to sell us stuff, sure. But if you think then about more carefully about that, and we don't know, and I say this in the book in chapter 5, I wanted to get research this question exactly. How are the data being used? For whose gain, right? Or to whose gain, whose benefit. And you can't, right? It's all locked under legal mechanisms, license and use agreements, by trade secrecy law. No one would talk to me about this, except when I looked at financial documents, you can make inferences. So we know that companies talk to other companies and they talk to investors saying, hey, data are a real a future revenue stream, right? So we know that the companies are going to make money off of the data themselves. But we also can infer based on past behavior. So we know that companies like chemicals companies have used price discrimination historically, right? So they're so big, again, there's only a small handful of input suppliers that they can basically operate outside of the economic forces of supply and demand, right? They basically set prices. And we know that corporations have done this. And we know, for example, that even like a fuel company, right? Or a fossil fuel company, the NFU has these beautiful graphs where, you show like a slight increase in a commodity price one year, and then the price of fuel, right, tracks that increase, or the price of like chemical inputs tracks that increase. And so you can see, and I forget where the NFU has those graphs and what reporting, but they've charted it beautifully using these visual statistics that show that basically the input suppliers increase the prices at the absolute threshold, like, that farmers can pay, and they increase them based on fluctuations in the commodities market, for example, such that any extra profit a farmer was going to make, it's gone already, right? Mm-hmm. It's then gone to the input supplier. And so we can assume if these corporations have used price discrimination in the past, data analytics are just giving them another window to be able to write more information to set prices. So for example, and this is inference, but again, it's based on past behavior. So I think it's quite well reasoned and logical. If Bayer Monsanto can predict in a particular region based on data analytics, right, gathered over a series of precision tractors, that there's going to be a particular need for a certain chemical, right, then they can set that price. We also can infer that it might be used by reinsurance companies. I think that's a really logical, and I write about that in the book. So I think we don't know, basically, and we don't know because these data sets and the algorithms used to derive advice and what is actually happening with the data and who's benefiting. It's all protected by legal mechanisms. So a critical researcher like myself can't peek behind the curtain, but we can guess based on past behavior.
I asked Kelly if she's against things like precision agriculture, which relies on data. Does she see potential for data collection to do good?
So again, I'm not down on precision agriculture or the potential of digital tools, by no means, right? But, and one of the things, as you say, that it could be great if large industrial farmers could reduce their inputs, right, of harmful or scarce resources like water, harmful inputs like chemicals, right, and scarce inputs like water. If they could use a kind of precision analytics to do that and variable rate, great. One argument to be made is that that's still just an amendment, right, of the current system. So it's not really broader, I would argue, the kind of broader change that I think we know is necessary, right? In that, currently agriculture on aggregate in Canada contributes 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. Like, do we need to tweak this or do we need to radically rethink this, I guess is the question. And I'm in the latter camp. I think we need to radically rethink this. But I think the second problem is that, right, we know that a lot of the problems, as you say, with industrial agriculture are not just technical problems, right, but they're wrapped up in the political economy and in the justice issues, right? We know that the model has favored not just bigger and fewer farmers, but a grand inequity between agribusinesses and farmers. And for all of the reasons we mentioned before, the reasons that we should look at agriculture like we do social media, right? Those same powerful corporations stand to benefit enormously through this new technical system that is big data and data analytics. And if they stand to become even more concentrated and even more powerful, I think that in itself creates a host of social and environmental problems in this system.
What the book doesn't really go into is what to do, how to escape this idea of the immaculate conception of data. I could hardly ask questions without using very immaculate sounding phrases like data-driven agriculture, as if data has the ability to jump up and drive a tractor or something.
We started out kind of just by talking about what the immaculate conception of data is. I'd like to end by asking, if not that, then what?
Yeah, that's such a good question.
How should people enable to think about data and digitally driven agriculture?
No, it's such a good question. And I had given it some thought, even though I didn't write about it. I know I did that really annoying thing where I'm like, this is the wrong way to think about it. And I don't give us much of where we need to go. But I think for one, we just need to watch our linguistic practices. Again, not just in agriculture, but more broadly, right? Just really catch ourselves instead of describing data driven and raw data, and right, instead of describing technologies as if they're natural resources pulled from the ground or as if they came from God on high, right? Really create in our language and in our analytical practices or the ways we think and talk and in the research that we do, really create visibility around the people, and I would call it the interests, right, around data practices. So really make space for asking questions like, wait a second, why collect data on that variable and not this other one? And is that going to be a private data set? And, if a farmer helped collect that data set, where does that data go and who benefits from it? Should the farmer share in some of those data benefits? So really create visibility around the back end, right, of these data systems, who's collecting the data and then where the data are going and who's really benefiting from them. So I think it's sort of a matter of language and just thinking really carefully and critically about what's done. But then at the same time, also maybe stepping way back again, outside of thinking of technologies as the driving force for societal progress and starting to ask about ask the broader questions like, wait a second, what kind of food system or what kind of society do we want in the first place? And then how might new technological projects help us get there, if at all, right? Maybe we have other ways of organizing our lives or other kinds of levers besides just investing in shiny new things that can help us get to where we want to go.
You've been listening to my conversation with author and professor Kelly Bronson. If you'd like to learn more, you can read her book. It's called The Immaculate Conception of Data. This has been another episode of Between the Rows with me, your cat lady host, Geraldine Witchers. It was produced by Bruce Thorson. Thanks for listening.
Maybe you've had an idea about upgrading your operation. Maybe about finally getting that renovation done or buying some new equipment. Or maybe you're thinking about how you can be a bit more financially secure from season to season. Get some help making it happen by speaking with an RBC Agriculture Account Manager. Then, set up an investment plan to make even more of your ideas happen. Visit rbc.com/chartyourcourse and get started today.